There were 39,000 organ transplants performed in 2020. That's a lot of potentially life-saving operations. But it's also worth noting that there are 106,572 people on donor lists. So the need far outweighs the ability to fill it. That's part of the reason why there are some rigorous standards in place to qualify for an organ transplant. Unfortunately, not all of those standards and reasons turn out to be good ones. Number 10. Criminal history. When a hospital considers the reasons for or against giving someone a transplant, they will inevitably settle on one in particular when it comes to denials. If a patient who needs a liver doesn't stop drinking, that's a cause to deny the transplant. Likewise, a lung transplant patient will be denied if they keep smoking. But sometimes they'll offer up more esoteric reasons, like non-compliance. In organ transplant terms, that can mean a lot of things, like a fear that the patient won't follow through on steps to ensure a healthy recovery after the fact. Back in 2013, for 15-year-old Anthony Stokes, non-compliance was the reason he was denied a life-saving heart transplant. Officially, it meant that the boy had a history of poor grades and spending time in juvenile detention. So basically, the hospital refused to save his life because he had a criminal history. At 15. After the story got out, the hospital miraculously reviewed their position and changed their mind. The boy, who was given 6 months to live, was granted a surgery and received a transplant. In one final tragic twist, 2 years later, Stokes died in a car crash after fleeing police. Number 9. Vaccination status. The COVID-19 pandemic has more ups and downs than a pogo stick, but one thing that slowly grew out of it was the divide between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. Those who remain unvaccinated found that more and more of the world was becoming unwelcoming to them. Restaurants, movie theaters, and borders were closed to those who couldn't prove their vaccine status. And if you can't eat indoors at a restaurant without being vaccinated, maybe it makes sense that you can't get a lung transplant either. With over half the world vaccinated, including about 64% of the United States, hospitals have begun cracking down on the unvaccinated in some serious ways. Most notably when they denied a heart transplant to 31-year-old DJ Ferguson, in part because he remains unvaccinated. According to the hospital, they take vaccine status and lifestyle choices into account when determining who qualifies for the very limited number of organ transplants towards their goal of ensuring the best chance of survival for recipients. In other words, if you aren't willing to get vaccinated against a disease that probably could kill you thanks to your compromised post-transplant immune system, they're not going to bother with the procedure in the first place. After a transplant, a patient's immune system barely exists at all, so the vaccine is essential in their eyes. Number 8. The numbers game. Around 40% of the fruits and vegetables produced on farms are trashed before consumers ever get to see them for no other reason than because they're ugly. Imperfect produce is considered unsellable, so it's not even sold, which is a huge waste. Turns out this same attitude applies to human organs. Imperfect organs, by whatever metric one uses to determine such a label, began being turned away with a change to federal standards in 2007. This was essentially an issue of the bottom line. Imperfect organs make for higher risk surgeries, just like a recipient who is extremely ill. The more risky a surgery is, the less likely it is to be successful. If too many unsuccessful surgeries are performed, a hospital's rankings go down and they will receive less federal funding. So, in order to keep their ratings high, they simply perform fewer transplants and only go for what they consider to be sure thing surgeries. This point of view flies in the face of what transplant surgeries are meant to do in the first place. And that's the idea that the sickest people deserve the organs first. After a report outlining this was issued, standards were changed to allow hospitals to have more surgical fails without losing funding, but it still seems to be a metric by which funding is gauged. Number 7. Patients rejected for being too poor. Imagine learning that your heart is failing, and if you want to survive, you need a transplant. We already know that there are 100,000 people waiting for organs, only near a fraction of that number to go around. But assuming you're in otherwise good health and check all the right boxes for qualification, you have to be near the top of the list, right? Well, now imagine finding out that the average cost of a heart transplant is over $1.3 million. It seems weird to suggest that you can be denied a life-saving procedure because you can't afford it, but it turns out you can. Hedda Martin was denied a heart transplant because her finances were not up to the task of covering the job. The hospital recommended she help start a fundraiser to pull in at least $10,000. Patients are routinely required to prove in advance that they can pay before any progress is made on a potential transplant. While a heart is the most expensive, even a kidney can cost up to $400,000. Plus, there are anti-rejection drugs that can cost $2,500 a month as long as you plan to live after the surgery. Many recipients start GoFundMe campaigns, but if the money doesn't flow, neither do the organs. Number 6. Potential disability risk. Obviously, as lay people, we're not privy to the same information medical professionals have when deciding who gets an organ transplant and, in effect, who lives and who dies. But we can make some assumptions that align with what makes sense. What should be right in a subjective sense. When we hear that a baby needs a heart transplant, that seems like a no-brainer to us. Of course, a baby moves to the top of the list. It's a baby. In 2013, a 5-month-old baby born with a heart defect was denied a heart transplant. 2 surgeries had already failed, and he was in heart failure. He was going to die. Doctors said that his condition put him at risk of tumors and infections. But when his mother researched his condition online, she couldn't find a single mention of that being the case. A doctor later confirmed this to her. One thing she did know was that children with her son's condition often grew up to have serious disabilities, and that was what she believed the true reason was. The same thing had happened to a 3-year-old girl who needed a kidney transplant, and while it's known that intellectual disabilities will keep people off the transplant list, which we'll get into shortly, this was a preemptive strike on a baby who hadn't even had time to develop one way or the other. Number 5, intellectual disabilities. One of the biggest moral questions the healthcare industry has dealt with in regards to transplants is what should disqualify a person from receiving one. And no issue is more debated than intellectual disabilities. To some, it's literally considered a waste of an organ to transplant it into someone with an intellectual disability. Unsurprisingly, the issue comes up, is tossed around in the media, and maybe even some petitions are signed, but not a lot of progress is made. As late as 2021, there was some hope that the issue of disability discrimination might get before Congress, but there's still no official rule on the books, and hospitals around the country continue to deny transplants to those with intellectual disabilities on the grounds that they're not able to properly care for themselves and therefore can't get the most out of the organ. Number 4, faulty test results. There are as many as 12 million diagnostic test errors in America every year. Tens of thousands of people die per year as a result of medical errors, upwards of 22,000 according to recent research, with some of those numbers undoubtedly the result of testing errors. But what happens when testing is needed to determine who gets organ transplants? Well, they can screw that up too. A woman who needed a liver transplant found herself rejected from the list when doctors determined that she'd been drinking alcohol. Obviously, that'd be a big disqualifier for a liver. You don't want someone to get a new one if they're just going to destroy it. But the problem was, the woman hadn't been drinking. The problem with testing for things like this is that doctors are predisposed to not believe patients when they have contradictory evidence. And they're not necessarily wrong about that. Lots of patients lie. But not everybody lies. In this case, it turned out the woman's bladder was producing its own alcohol. After looking into the case more, she was eventually reconsidered for transplant. Number 3, marijuana use. 36 states currently allow for the use of medical marijuana, and half of that allow for its recreational use. A number of countries around the world have also legalized, or at least decriminalized its use in many circumstances as well. Despite its legality, there have been cases where transplants were denied to people using it as it was legally prescribed. Timothy Guerin died after being denied a liver because of his marijuana use. The hospital said that this was not the sole factor in determining any patient's eligibility, but Guerin's lawyer disagreed. Guerin's doctor had prescribed marijuana for him to deal with the nausea and pain caused by his condition. The hospital said that he had to be off the drug for 6 months, but he didn't even have that long to live. They recommended a 60-day program, but his condition was too advanced for that as well. Number 2, history of alcohol abuse. More than once now, we've addressed the idea that a person might be denied a transplant on their history of substance abuse. In particular, a person can be denied a liver if they've got a history of drinking. On paper, that makes sense, but in practice, it can often be discriminatory. An Indigenous Canadian woman was denied a liver transplant based on a history of alcohol use. It was suspected that acetaminophen had actually caused her liver damage, and though she had a drinking problem in the past, she was apparently sober at the time she needed the surgery. Nonetheless, she was denied. An Indigenous man from BC was also denied after he failed to meet a 6-month abstinence policy the province of BC had set up for those in need of a liver. Indigenous Canadians have disproportionately high rates of alcoholism in their communities due to a number of systemic conditions, ranging from abuses in residential schools, poverty, and racist policies that severely impacted their ability to thrive and even survive in Canada. The abstinence requirement was challenged as being discriminatory on those grounds. The policy was alleged to be rescinded in 2018, although the case we just mentioned happened in 2019. The transplant board called this a mistake, and the man was put back on the list to have a transplant. Number 1, father violated probation. The only thing worse than being denied an organ for something you've done is being denied for something someone else did. That's what happened to 2-year-old AJ Burgess. Burgess was born prematurely and in need of a kidney. His father was a perfect match and had a kidney spare. Seemed like a no-brainer, but the hospital refused to perform the transplant because the father had served time for a parole violation. The hospital stated that they needed parole and probation information so they could see that he'd been on his best behavior for 3 or 4 months before they'd perform the transplant. Luckily, after the outcry, another matching kidney was found, and Burgess got a transplant after all.